so Derek and Mallory, I want to start off the conversation with something similar to what I asked the congressman, but the idea of these three topics of education, transportation, and infrastructure are often discussed in silos. So from a policy standpoint or from a growth trajectory standpoint, what's the rationale for thinking of those things in the same vein or at least linked together in some way? Mallory, maybe let's start with you if there are growth aspects that suggest why we should be thinking of these things similarly, and then Derek, go to you.
Yeah, well, I'll just start by saying we have a history of planning for these things and thinking about growth. In Utah, our population has kind of always grown since we were counted in the decennial census. So we have a very long history of growth. And then, in the work that we do at the Gardner Institute, we produce long-term planning projections to look out into the future that are used heavily by our transportation planning organizations, water organizations, agencies. Education uses those as well. So everyone wants to kind of stay a step ahead of the changes we're anticipating. And so hopefully our data can help with that.
Yeah, well, I think that, there's one of the commonalities, I guess, between education, infrastructure, and transportation is they're all things that are real tools for us to go places in life, whether that's physically, you drive on the freeway to get to school here or go to work. Or with education, your launches you into your life. Now, I'll say, particularly with education, that's not all education is, right? Education, I think it's worth noting, is an end in itself, right? Expands your mind, can expand your soul, kind of thing. But in the sense that it's similar to these other issues, it is kind of a mechanism for moving in your life where you want to be.
So let's dive into growth a little bit more. I mean, again, the growth that Utah's experiencing is not really a surprise to any of us. We see it every day. We feel sometimes the traffic congestion. Think, where'd all these people come from? But it's a good thing because it means people want to move here and the people that are here want to raise their families here. And so I want to ask kind of a general question, and again, start with you, Mallory. What do we need to understand about Utah's growth, our population growth and change? In what ways are we growing? Thinking about migration coming in versus families here having kids and raising those kids here. Just give us kind of a lay of the land of what growth is happening and why that matters in the context of discussions about things like education and transportation.
Yeah, so if we look last decade, 2/3 of our growth came from natural increase. So that's the births minus the deaths. I will say those births can be from people who moved here last decade and had their kids here. If you look back a little farther, in the 1990s, we saw a lot of migration to the state. I'm actually a result of that migration, and I consider myself a Utahn. So something to remember when we're thinking about those movers that are coming into the state. If we look out into the future, we do anticipate migration to play a bigger role, in part because we have aging population. So unfortunately, as you age, you're more and more likely that you're going to kind of exit the population. And then we have declining fertility rates and declining births. So declining fertility rates with a caveat on that declining births. So when you have more deaths and fewer births, that kind of shifts that natural increase lever of growth. And then we anticipate in our work, the economy in the state is still going to be something that's attractive to people. It's going to keep growing, it's going to keep diversifying. And so we anticipate migration being a stronger factor, really driven by the economics. I will say that the births, we have these declining fertility rates, but we also are going to see a larger chunk of the population get to childbearing age. So even if everyone decided to have fewer kids, if you have a larger population that could potentially have kids, you do see increases in the births over time, as well as that school age, kid population. So something to consider. There is there's a lot of layers to all of that growth.
So Derek, what implication does this have? I mean, in a very simplistic way, probably that, more people means we need to educate more folks, we need more capacity for people to get around in terms of transportation. What are some of the policy implications that you think our elected leaders, such as Congressman Owens and our state leaders, need to be aware of that growth is going to have by way of impact on those issues?
Yeah. Well, one I think that they generally are aware of is the increased impact on our infrastructure, whether that's roads, whether that's energy needs and those kinds of things. We need more sewers, more homes, more of everything as there's more people. There are a lot of challenges in lots of those areas, so it's not as simple as saying we need these things and therefore they're going to happen. Voila, they're here. But that's one implication. I think one gets back to what Mallory said about how nuanced this is. As the type of growth we're experiencing happens with more people, but an aging population, you start to see changes, particularly within the state. So, for example, in Salt Lake School District, the growth that's happening there is such that they're having to consider closing down. I think it's like 7 schools or something, a number of elementary schools, because they're getting more people, but they're having fewer kids in their schools. Whereas, say, in a place like Utah County, there are a lot more kids down there, relatively speaking, in terms of sources of growth. And so it's going to vary across the state, but ultimately you are going to need more of something or a variety of things. And also the services that we need for our population is going to change. So with an aging demographic, older generation, older people need different services than kids and young families. And so that's some changes that we're going to see. I think you're going to start to experience it too in, how communities are built, for example, and what amenities are provided in a community versus ones that you're expected to drive somewhere and go get those. So those things are going to change too.
It sounds like there's a theme maybe we can tease out that as we're experiencing this growth and we're looking at how it impacts education, transportation, and other elements of infrastructure, it's maybe not quite as simple as just, well, everything we have today, let's just dial the volume up and have more of what we have today. Yes, there are probably some capacity needs, but also, is there a demand for, I guess, greater variety of greater types of things like educational pathways, whether that's K-12 options or post-secondary workforce training. So Mallory, I want to start with you. Is there anything that you have seen in terms of the demographic trends that show sort of demand pushing on not just upward pressure on capacity, but I don't know if lateral pressure, whatever the right term would be, but for more types of educational or vocational pathways? Is the demand not just growing, but is it also demanding different kinds of things? Anything in your data that might give a clue to that?
I mean, I think it's easier to look at transportation for me, just I'm a little more aware of that, but looking at transportation, a lot of their growth is along the Wasatch Front. It's along this skinny, narrow, constrained corridor, and there are more and more people coming in, and there's not places to do the normal of building a new freeway, continuing to expand a freeway. You also have different needs and desires of those residents to get up and down that teeny skinny corridor. And so, I think just looking at the growth and what we anticipate moving forward, there has to be different solutions added into the mix, because what we have now, just continuing on that kind of status quo, isn't going to be sustainable.
So as you're looking at that, let's expand on that for a moment for folks in the room in the context of broadband. So when we talk about infrastructure, and that could be everything from transportation, public transportation, cars. There's other elements of infrastructure such as, water and sewer for new developing communities, things like parks or law enforcement and emergency response. And so as you're articulating, look, the growth where it's happening will kind of impact what kinds of things are needed. Is an expansion of broadband internet something that can maybe take some of the pressure off of that, especially in the post-COVID era where we've seen so much more remote work and hybrid work? For either one of you, is that maybe a solution that can help address some of the pressures that you're identifying, Mallory? Derek?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no, I think. So, if you have, say, more people working remote or on a flex schedule of some kind, because you have better internet access and things for like video conferencing, video calls, that kind of thing, that will ease some pressures on other types of infrastructure. However, if the population growth overall is large enough, that might overwhelm the shift towards remote. Simply the number of people, who are still going into the office at least several days a week. So it's a little bit uncertain, I think. But you will see, I think, different types of challenges than we've had before, and things like broadband internet could be ways of either addressing those things, or it could lead to the kinds of innovations that could address those things. There's I think some examples of, for example, Silicon Valley or the Silicon Slopes here, where you have high levels of technological advancement, and that creates all types of new innovations and things that change how we live and work and raise our families in ways that alleviate some problems and then maybe create new ones or new challenges that we have to start facing that we hadn't thought about before.
Mallory, I want to go back to something that you mentioned of the declining fertility rates in general throughout the country in the West, and somewhat surprisingly for folks perhaps here in Utah. And there was a Gardner Institute policy forum that Derek participated on as a panelist as well, and Mallory, your work informing that audience of kind of some of these demographic trends. Maybe to put it very simply, if folks out there are thinking, okay, so on the one hand we're saying we're growing too fast and we're trying to accommodate that. And then there's other data that's coming out saying, well, our fertility rates are declining. Why wouldn't the response be, great, maybe that's going to offset it a little bit, we won't have to worry so much? Is it a little more complicated than that?
I think there's a lot of judgment that's individual level on that kind of assessment. I do think if we anticipate continued growth kind of similar to what we have experienced in the past, then what you said, if the offset, that is what we, are counting on. If we shut off all the roads, everything, no one else can come in tomorrow. We actually have a paper that's going to come out soon, but if we kept the people who are here today and that's it, our population in 2060 would be 4 million instead of like 5.5. So it would we'd still grow, but it's a lot more moderate. And if you look to other Western states, if you look to like places like Montana or Wyoming, they've kind of had this very slow and steady growth rate, and that we'd be a little more like that compared to other places in our region that have been super fast growing and have experienced some different things. So I'll let everyone assess on their own value scale whether that's good or bad.
Sure. Derek, I want to go back to something you mentioned as well. When we're talking about geographic growth happening in different ways and at different levels in different regions, and you mentioned school districts, how there might be instances of closing some school districts, or schools rather, and needing to build more schools elsewhere. One, I want to ask you if there's anything deeper you want to mention on that, and are there any other sort of policy implications, perhaps tax revenues, as policymakers are kind of looking at the landscape of growth that's going to be uneven in different parts of the state, and then looking, okay, what does this mean for education? What does this mean for tax revenue? What does this mean for other government services that we need to fund? What else should people be aware of what some of those impacts might be?
Well, in the education space, and I should say, I think some of this is maybe due to population growth and demographic changes, but some of it is more just due to other factors regardless of the number of people. I think there is an increasing desire for different kinds of models of education that maybe that desire wasn't strong in the past. I think you saw it with COVID and people doing remote education. I know we have currently a 6th grader who at the time when things first shut down was in 2nd grade. And you got a different window into what your kids were learning and how they were learning. And for a lot of parents, I think that some maybe it changed their view dramatically, but probably the larger portion, it maybe didn't change it dramatically, but it did kind of have some effect, right, about what they like to see from their kids' education. And so you started to see an increase in demand and interest in programs, that would allow for either remote learning. You start to see more school districts form virtual schools, and a number of those have stuck around. Some have gone away after things kind of opened back up, but a number have stuck around. And you've also seen more interest in private school choice, being able to use public dollars to facilitate getting their child into private school or into more of a homeschool situation where they have a little more financial help or more resources that are not financial than maybe they did in the past. In fact, you start to see very interesting models, and this one predates COVID, but for a few years, we sent our daughter to a charter school down in Utah County in Pleasant Grove that had an in-person kind of typical experience if you wanted it. And then they had this other track where they would provide you access to curriculum materials. This is a public school, it's a public charter school. And you schooled at home, sometimes 5 days a week. You could do it more of like a 4-day a week model. And so they are, again, trying to accommodate parents with a variety of a diverse set of interests in how we educate kids. And I think that has grown over the years. A perfect example might be just looking at what happened, without wading into something too controversial. Then again, that's okay if we do that too, I suppose. The voucher program here that got referendumed. I don't know how you say that, but there was a referendum and it lost by 60 to 40 basically. And then just recently Utah passed a program that's comparable, but it's different. Has a lot more flexibility in how you can use the funds, and that doesn't seem to be drawing the same kind of opposition. There are some concerns, but you're not seeing that show up on the ballot from a referendum, for instance. So things have changed, and part of that is population growth and demographic change. Part of that is these other factors that have just broadened, the diversity of interest in how we educate our kids.
Derek, it strikes me that brings up something that Mallory, you and I talked about when we were prepping for this event together, but is this idea of adaptability, that as things are changing in the state, is what should elected officials take away from that in terms of, well, can we think outside the box more now than we used to because of these changing demographics? And Derek's example of an education policy intervention that public opinion maybe was different now than it was in years past. Is there anything else that you think should point to, because our demographics are changing and we're growing, maybe it just points to a general attitude of, let's be innovative. Let's think of policy solutions maybe we hadn't thought of before, or maybe that weren't quite ready yet. What are some key takeaways that elected officials should keep in mind in that regard?
I think they should keep in mind, and this isn't going to be very original, but the population is changing, and it's changing in ways that we've sort of seen in the past, but we're a different group of people that are Utahns now than we were in 2010, than we were in 2000, than we were in 1990. And so thinking that we should continue to operate the same way without giving things a second look or thinking about things differently is not what I would do if I was a decision maker. We're more racially and ethnically diverse on top of these shifts in our age structure. And so there's more going on than what we had in the past. And so I just think it provides an opportunity to maybe re-examine some things and maybe change things.
I want to follow up on this idea of different kinds of growth. And again, kind of those two broad categories of folks moving into the state versus native Utahns having kids, and both of those adding to the growth in different ways. Is there anything in any of the demographic data that shows that those two types of growth have any different impact on whether it is public policy or our communities, anything about our culture? And is there more of a generational rootedness for native Utahns? And I ask that with a huge caveat that I'm also not a native Utahn. I moved here a little over a decade ago, and now we're raising our kids here and feel very generationally rooted. We love Utah. And so is there anything that can point to those different kinds of growth manifesting in different ways with respect to pressure or influence on various policy? Or is it basically that, hey, once people move here and the congressman talked a lot about how great Utah is, if you come here to visit, you'll find yourself wanting to stay here. Is it all kind of this, everybody feels that rootedness, so maybe after a little while it doesn't really matter whether they moved here or have been here for a long time. It's all just part of the growth. These are new Utahns that now we need to accommodate through these various services. Any clues, does any of that make a difference in the long run?
We don't get any of the kind of why or attitude approach to anything in the work that we do. I would point people to Pew Research. They have a lot that kind of doesn't necessarily get to being a Utahn, but kind of talks about these shifts over time. I think you kind of answered your own question in the way that you navigated it, and thinking about people that I
I'm looking
know.
for data to back me
I
up,
know,
right?
unfortunately, we don't have that data because it's what people feel. It's a sentiment, right? And so that is great qualitative data, but we don't have that. So I would say if people are living here and they want to live here, then we need to understand that they're Utahns, and let's make sure that they're getting what they need.
Derek, anything to add to that from the policy angle?
Yeah, I mean, well, we don't have a lot of quantitative data like Mallory's saying. I think you have, historical examples, historical data. You could go back all the way to, ancient kind of examples if you wanted, but I think where you end up having significant change that really shakes things around is when you have dramatic, large inflows of people who come from another place, And I don't think we're experiencing anything on that order in Utah. So, yes, can it, in theory, change things? I think so. But is that what we're experiencing? I don't think so. We're experiencing maybe regular incremental inflow of people. But also, just to highlight some of the new initial nuance, Mallory mentioned some, about people move here and then have kids. There are a lot of people who move here who were born here. Like they leave the state for a period of time and come back, whether that's
5% of movers right before COVID.
Yeah. So, just the fact that they moved in doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have a strong attachment here. And this is why I get into, I don't think we're having that huge influx of people into any community really. Never say never, maybe there is some, right, that I'm not aware of. But the point is just that as a state, as a whole, you are probably seeing some incremental change because if folks have been born elsewhere, grown up elsewhere, and then you come to a state, whether it's Utah or any other state for that matter, things are going to be a little different than years two. And so I think it's normal you maybe like some of that stuff that's different, and maybe you don't like some of that stuff that's different. And you have to work through that, as in your community. And if you do have a community maybe that draws people that way, I think I actually live in a city that if there is one that has that dynamic going on, it's Lehigh, right? It's kind of right in the kind of Silicon Slopes kind of area. So you have a lot of people who are coming from either from Silicon Valley, companies setting up shop here or things like that. And they want to live close to their businesses. Lehigh's generally a good location. But I wouldn't say you're having such inflow that it's like it doesn't feel like Utah anymore or anything close to that really. But there are different dynamics you do have to wade through because people with different views or of whatever stripe, whether that's political, cultural, other kinds of views, you have to wade through those things.
Seems like there's to some extent a consensus that folks who want to move here, Utah's a great place, come on in. And folks who want to stay here, we hope you stay here because Utah's a great place, and so much of the opportunity and the quality of life. And from the congressman's comments, it's really comes down to we know we're growing, we welcome the growth. It's a good, public policy challenge to have to be able to ask yourself the question, okay, well, how do we educate everyone? How do we have an infrastructure that supports this growth? And as we're in the process of answering those questions as a state, I wonder if there are any things we can learn from any other states around the country or any other regions. Is there any place that's really just figured it out, that is able to say, hey, we're growing, but our education system is keeping pace the way it needs to, our infrastructure is keeping pace the way it needs to? Any best practices, or are there things that we should be looking for? If we haven't found a really good best practice yet, what kinds of clues could we maybe find in other states or other regions that could help inform how we grow here? Mallory, maybe start with you. Anything that we ought to be looking for?
I will say, and I was thinking about, I'm on a panel in like 2 weeks looking at aging in place and planning, so I could have come back with more information after that panel. But I will say, like the Northeast of the United States, and I know that's a very culturally different place, but they've been experiencing the aging of the population in a really dramatic way for a lot longer than us. And so if there are communities that, are experiencing things a little bit more rapidly here that aren't sure what to do, like maybe there are some examples there. And then this is kind of connected, but the state is using a previous example kind of Envision Utah processes, but they're doing an outreach project looking at water, transportation, open space, and affordable housing called Guiding Our Growth. And today is the last day, or tomorrow is the last day that you can submit your comments on what you think there. But the state is also trying to get input from people on how we do navigate these things in a way that maybe alleviates some of those pinch points we're feeling right now.
Derek, what should we be looking for elsewhere as far as best practices?
Well, if it's okay, I'd like to actually jump back. I don't know that I have a ton to say on that. There are examples of states that are growing, but I don't have particularly strong insights into those. But I want to amend one thing I was talking about earlier, because it's just a thought occurred to me, that maybe you are having some areas in Utah where demographic change in population growth, or in this case, not lack of growth, is changing things in this. It's probably rural Utah, right? So I think there are areas of the state where, either the population is decreasing, or where just a little bit of demographic change can have a big impact just because of the total number of children's high. And you do have that going on in places of rural Utah. And maybe that is actually to the question, because I know I just basically skipped the question. I think there are probably things to learn on that score. There are a lot of areas of the country that either they're rural, or they were based on industries that were thriving, say in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and have decreased over time. Of what the impacts are of that kind of demographic change, and it creates real challenges for those communities. And things like deaths of despair, things like just how you deal with just a decreasing population of people beyond the deaths of despair issue. But that's one thing that's popped up in a lot of areas, and so that's something we need to be, I think, very conscious as we talk about population growth and changes. Is there is growth in a lot of the state, and then there is a lack of growth or decrease in other areas of the state, and those should not be combined.
Well, with that, we'll transition to our Q&A portion. So any folks in the audience, any thoughts or questions, what's on your mind that you want to ask our panelists? And I think we should have a couple of house microphones to go around. I think Nic might have just stepped out, but if someone can track him down, we'll bring a microphone to you. So go ahead and raise your hand with any questions that you have for our panelists. And while you're thinking about what questions you have, I guess to start kind of this room discussion, it seems like if there's nothing else that we can take away from this entire conversation, is basically this idea that as we understand the growth that is happening and in different ways in different regions, and also the aging of the population, there's demographic change happening, and sometimes that can make folks a little anxious to say, well, I like Utah the way it is. Maybe I don't want it to change, but it seems to be that the key policy question is, how do we accommodate this growth that we know is here and will continue in a way that all of us can say, well, my quality of life as a Utahn is not diminished, my opportunities are not diminished. And in fact, those things are improved, and especially for the next generation, for our kids, that they can call Utah home and have a quality of life and a suite of opportunities in their lives that is as good as or better than we've experienced. So it seems like is that kind of a key principle? Anything you would add to that as a takeaway principle? And then we'll go to any questions from folks in the audience.
Well, I think it's one of the driving principles for a lot of people. Are we building kind of community that, or a state or city, that my kids are going to be able to grow up in, and where I want them to grow up in, and that they're going to have those opportunities? Because it's one of those kind of key questions of the American dream, right? Is what do you feel about the prospects for your kids, or alternatively, how are people's economic prospects relative to previous generations? We use those as gauges of things. So I think it's clearly a principle that matters in these conversations.
Mallory, anything to add to that?
I think the conversations I am in are always, how are our kids going to live here? That is an overarching theme. And I think one kind of nerd point is we've kind of entered into like the next stage of states. Like, we're not a tiny state anymore. We're kind of like middle-sized state. But with that, there are new challenges. And I think some of the challenges are kind of new to us as Utahns, or for Utah decision makers. They're coming in ways that maybe we thought we were kind of immune to, I think, because we are a special place. We had, historically been a little bit isolated, and And so I think change can be difficult, change can be hard, but I think it's showing that we're maturing. We're maturing out of kind of our like startup phase of statehood, and you know, there will continue to be new challenges that come up, and so just remembering, you know, if I was a decision maker, you know, the desire to serve all Utahns would be in the back of my mind.
Excellent. So questions from the audience, please go ahead and raise your hand. Anybody have a question they want to ask our panelists about growth, about education policy, about transportation? Go here first, sir, and then you in the back.
Obviously, government needs to provide the support for a growing population. But there are a lot of things the government would like to do that really don't need to be done. So talk me through, if you would, the disadvantages of allowing a more laissez-faire kind of growth. Let businesses locate where they want to locate. Let people live where they want to live. Let apartment buildings be built where they can make money. Why shouldn't we just allow laissez-faire growth to happen, supported obviously by however the government can support it?
Well, I don't think I'll jump in there. I think you're seeing some of that, and it depends on communities. You know, different communities handle it differently. I think, for instance, interestingly enough, because it kind of smacks, I think, against the stereotype, when you see housing growth and development in places like Salt Lake City, are they laissez-faire? I don't know. I would describe it that way, but they are very open-minded in letting developers come in and potentially provide solutions for their community. It's not all about now has to fit all these straitjacket kinds of requirements. In some communities, though, that is kind of how it is, right? They have a very significant defined community feel, and they want to stick things within that context. So, I mean, I guess specifically to your question, why can't we do kind of more of a laissez-faire, more just kind of a let things grow as people desire? I think you can. I think you just have to be ready to accept the consequences of that, right? The natural outcomes of that, which is there might be some things that come into the community you don't like. And that's where I think you get a lot of pushback, when people see that that's what they feel is happening in their communities. And so maybe, I guess, what I'm coming to is maybe the reason that doesn't happen as much is simply because there's so many communities where there tends to be some kind of backlash against it when people really do just try to let things go as say property owner wanted or developer or whatever. But at the same time, I think you do have a significant openness, and maybe more than we give credit for, to allowing growth in ways that meets the unique needs we have in terms of housing or water infrastructure, population growth and development. It's maybe a little more complicated, I think, than maybe you might just see in the headlines and that kind of thing.
Mallory, anything to add to that?
I'm thinking of the Envision Utah exercises they did in the early 2000s, and part of that was, cities could sign on, once they came up with their plans, cities could sign on to enact, in whatever way suited their community, plans that would match kind of the grand scheme, put forward in this Envision process. And part of that, the root of it was shared values, like shared desire to protect open space, shared we don't want sprawl everywhere, and we don't want to have to drive an hour and a half to get from my house up on campus. And so, I think even as we change, you still have those shared values. We're kind of seeing that in the initial, feedback we're getting from Guiding Our Growth. People move to Utah because they love, our outdoor space. We want to protect it. We love having openness and public spaces and green things, And so I think as the population changes, you still do have something brought people here, right? And it's shared or not, I think that's part of why you don't just let people do whatever they want. Some communities that might work great, but I think especially just the Wasatch Front itself, we're so close. It gets really tricky when you try to let people just kind of go out and do what they want.
Yeah, there are impacts to that kind of thing on other people.
Yeah.
Could I have one more thing too?
Please.
I think one issue that oftentimes people run up against in trying to do what they want to do, say with their property, for example, like you mentioned apartment buildings being built where they can make money and those kinds of things, is the level of understanding from local policymakers about what their authority really is and is not. We don't really do a great job, I think, in the state. Not saying the state should be the one to do it, but of helping people who get elected in city and county levels necessarily understand what their defined roles are in the Constitution, whether it's a state Constitution primarily, but maybe in the federal Constitution as well. And then within the system of Utah, within what statutes exist, delegating authority to cities and counties. And so now over time, I think you have a lot of city elected officials who pick that stuff up. So I'm not saying they don't know anything. I think a lot of them know a lot. But when they first come in, you have some struggles there. And so you get actions that ultimately either get overturned or that, maybe they don't get overturned initially, but it causes difficulties in how we grow and develop simply by a matter of, we need to truly understand what the roles of different levels of elected officials are and what they're not. And to the extent that that isn't happening, you can get a lot of things that just end up complicating growth unnecessarily. And it's complicated enough as it is. So we don't need to do it any more than that is.
It's an excellent question. Thank you. There was another hand back here.
So a common theme we were talking about today is education and the importance of education in Utah. But right now, Utah's number 43 in the United States for per pupil spending. Do you think that's going to change at any point, or do you think the Utah legislature is going to put more of an emphasis on trying to educate? It's better. I just kind of want to know you guys' opinion on that.
Yeah, well, so I think that has been changing. We've been kind of moving up the scale little by little, and I think the first thing that you have to understand is, whenever you're talking about a per pupil level of education spending in Utah, is the unique challenge that, we're the only state with a lot of kids, but we are one of the states with a lot of kids. And so, when you look at how, say, the legislature actually chooses to spend the discretionary funds that they have, the overwhelming chunk of it goes to schools. I think it's hard to really look at the facts and honestly say that our state lawmakers are not spending money on schools. Now, a lot of people want them to spend more, and that's what a lot of our policy debates are about. And I think that's why you have been seeing Utah kind of move up the scale there a little bit. But given the dynamic of how many kids we have, it's really challenging to see Utah being like the top 5 or something. So because I think if we were ever being honest about how much money that would require and the tax rates that would require, it would be rejected wholesale. And we never get there. I think because the people who want more funding in education recognize that it will be rejected wholesale, so they don't go there. And that's okay, right? I mean, that's politics, right? It's. I'm not trying to criticize that. I think it's just trying to describe that's how it plays out. So I think those are the challenges. But it's a great question.
Can we weigh in on that?
Well, I'll just say from the data side, we have a little piece in our projections. We have age detail, and so we have a piece that's looking at the school age population change over time, and we're showing, in the near future, kind of decreases in the school age population, but then about 10 years, 15 years later, it goes back up again. And so I just hope decision makers look at that whole picture and not just a couple year picture, because if they see a decrease and think that's an opportunity for maybe savings, we might have more kids coming down the pipeline, and we need to be prepared for them and not shortchange those kids in the future. So that would be my data related point.
So there's, and I don't know all the details on this, so I'm going to be a little vague because I don't want to say something that's just factually inaccurate. But there was this last legislative session, I believe, a new policy enacted specifically for this situation of when the school age, district enrollment decreases, and to help kind of cushion the blow to schools when that happens. So I think we do have policymakers who are thinking about those things, particularly with the kind of near-term projections, and taking steps to, like you say, make sure it doesn't lead to a school that loses 10% of its kids and 10% of its money, but it still has the same amount of buildings and infrastructure to pay for and all those kinds of things. And so I think there is some recognition of those realities going on.
Well, I don't know if the house lights are signaling we're almost out of time, or there's something else going on. But we have time for one more question, please, right here, and then we'll wrap up after that.
So you're talking about the open lands, stuff like that you mentioned, like the hiking and stuff like that. Along with that, as the population grows, farm and ranch land is decreased. Is the state doing anything to protect the ranching and farming of Utah, or is like the new vision for Utah just like a very urbanized place where farm and ranch isn't part of the economics or anything anymore?
I can't speak to what the state is doing, but I will say, 75% of us live along the Wasatch Front, so that leaves 25 other counties. Cache County and Washington County are our other two major population centers. So we do have a lot of counties with small populations that, as Derek mentioned, aren't really experiencing the growth or change in the way we're experiencing it up here. So we do have a couple different pictures to deal with in terms of that growth and change, but I can't speak to any kind of decisions on land use.
Yeah, at the state level, I don't know that there's a lot going on, primarily because that is a local decision. Whether land is used for commercial use, residential, or agriculture, or ranching, is kind of a local zoning decision in part, and in part it's a federal decision because Utah is 2/3 controlled by the federal government, and a lot of those ranching land, grazing, and those kinds of things are happening on federal lands, and so there's a limited amount that the policymakers at the state level even can do, just because of the land dynamic, but also that they would probably try to do because even if you're talking about land that's not federal controlled, it's often left to counties and cities to make those decisions, and that is where I'm really unfamiliar with what they're doing in terms of the question you're asking. So I wish I could say more than that.
Well, we're at time. All good questions. Thank you all for weighing in, and thanks for being here. And just want to mention this is the last of the Sutherland Congressional Series for this year. So thanks to all of you for attending, and thanks, of course, to our online audience for participating. On the screens here, you'll see a QR code for a survey. We encourage you all to please fill out that survey. Let us know how you liked this event. If there were any other of these events in this series that you attended, we welcome that feedback. We always like to continuously improve these events. And also big thanks to the Hinckley Institute and the University of Utah for being our venue host and providing this wonderful space for all of you to hear from your elected officials and have some great conversations. So please join me in thanking our policy panel. Thank you.